Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Gio and Joey Show. We had a little Christmas break and New Year's break. Joey, how you doing? Introduce our guests and our topic for tonight.
Well, seeing as it's the first day back at school today, I'm doing okay. I guess I'm still alive. But no, I'm really excited for our guest today. He's the author of the very important Religious Liberty Substack, religiousliberty.tv, Michael Peabody. So thank you very much for coming on. How you doing today, Michael?
I'm doing really well. I mean, so much stuff happening in the last 24 hours. It's just mind blowing. So it's
Yeah.
the right time to be talking about this stuff.
Yes, it is.
News cycles are, they used to talk about the 24/7 news cycle, but it feels like it's even faster than a day. It feels like in one day we get like a year's worth of news.
Mhm. So as
That's
we get
absolutely true.
yes, as we get started on this, because I'm fascinated, obviously, knowing our understanding of the Bible and the what's coming in the future, whether it's a year from now or further down the line. How do you see the tension of religious liberty going on during these days at the moment with all the things that are happening, like in Minnesota, California, Venezuela, things like that?
I mean, well, religion is kind of like your human operating system. It's sort of like what you see the world through. And so if you see things in terms of your faith, you're always looking at events through that lens. And I think right now, there's all this religious liberty things going on. It just matters if they affect you or not. I mean, the rest of the world has been sustaining ongoing persecution for many, many years. I know we just put up an article the other day about what's going on in China with the religious persecution that's happened there. We've seen a lot of stuff going on. So, but I think right now we're at a critical time in the United States. We've got so much stuff going on. Internally, we have this Heritage Foundation report that just came out saying that it wouldn't be a bad idea for people to coordinate their day of rest. That just came out last week.
Yeah,
We've got
January 8th.
January 8th, yeah. So, and it's kind of interesting. I mean, I love constitutional law. I love being on the cutting edge of this stuff. And so for somebody who's been watching these things go on for so long, I look at it and I'm very fascinated by it. I don't know where it's going to go or not. We don't, not everything is the end of the world. A lot of things come up and then kind of peter away. And so you don't want to put all your eggs in the basket that it's going to be the end of the world. When you see some event happening, I mean, my grandmother used to always tell me, well, it's the end of the world. It's happening. It's going to happen. And this was like 50 years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of old, but and then she passed away. And I'm sure people during World War II felt like that was the end of the world, and it was. And for a lot of people, people in Rwanda, so many people died back in the 90s. So I like to look at things kind of like, what can we do about them now? How are they going to affect us now? And what can we do about these situations rather than always having to put them against some kind of a backdrop of what's coming prophetically?
Before we go forward, tell people about your Substack and where they can find it, the title of it, because that's how I interact with you the most. Even though we're on that group chat, I hardly get on there. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'll tell you what. I mean, actually, I've transitioned over to Substack. I used to do primarily everything off the website on religiousliberty.tv, and then I found out Substack is a better way of getting information out there, getting interactions, and kind of relating to the community. When you have a website, you're kind of out there on an island, hoping that people will come to it, and it's not always easy to get people to visit websites. I mean, I know personally, I look at like maybe 5 websites a day, and I do most of my stuff through social media. So I decided to kind of move it over there where people are. But we started that in 2008, the website. It's almost 18 years old in June. And the main thing was I wanted to have kind of a ongoing dialogue with people about religious liberty issues when they come up. I know that, people go to Liberty Magazine, they'll go to magazines, books, whatever, to read about religious liberty. But religious liberty happens at the speed of thought. I mean, there are issues that come up immediately and they need to be responded to. If we're not out there putting our perspective out there for people, it will, they'll get it from somewhere else. So what I decided to do was actually launch this as a newsletter and website initially, and we've then moved to Substack. I know I've talked to people at Liberty in different places, and I said, look, get on this. The Sentinel needs to be timely. It needs to be, the Sentinel. When I was a kid, they had a newspaper that would come out every so often. It looked like a newsprint, and it's called the Sentinel, and it came out. And then there's Liberty Magazine also, and we need something like that, some kind of early warning system, and also an educational tool to teach people how to think about the issues, how to not analyze them. Because I was running into all these people who'd say, well, this stuff is interesting, but when's the Sunday law coming? When's this going to happen? That's all I care about. I'm like, you got to understand how the Constitution works. So, and the reality is, if you're in law school, you get about, you get 1 year of constitutional law, and of that, you may get a month or a month and a half of First Amendment stuff, including everything from free speech to all the other rights that are in there, and maybe just a couple days on religious freedom. So if you read the website that we put out and you read the Substack, you will get more of an education on First Amendment, free exercise clause, and establishment clause issues than you would if you went to law school. I guarantee you that. And it's free.
Yeah, no offense to my seminary experience.
Hope your sound's not coming in. I mean, it's coming in a little bit, but it's faint.
What about now? Is it better?
That's better.
Okay, my seminary experience, and I got a degree, Master's of Divinity. Most of my grounding in Christ has been done reading on my own and reading, and studying and wrestling with the things myself. The professors give you an insight into how to attack a problem, but you have to do the work, and it usually goes beyond the book. So I could definitely see what you're saying. A textbook will never beat a real life experience and real life decisions that you analyze from the Supreme Court or a lower court of how they're looking at things and deciding it at the moment. And so having a fresh perspective. How often do you write on your Substack?
Now, we put stuff out almost every day now. It used to be, and we use AI to help out a bit on it. And the reason for that is because I do this for free. And we've kind of developed a AI protocol that does a very good job of actually putting the information in accurately. And so we're putting out information, at least, sometimes I do like 2 or 3 a day, depending on what's coming out. I think today I posted 3 times.
Okay. All right, Joey, jump in here.
Yeah, no, I was gonna second what you said about it being a good educational tool. So personally, I read your Substack and I listen to advisory opinions with David French and Sarah Isgerov at Dispatch, and that's kind of my Supreme Court watch material. It's very useful, and one of the things that I've appreciated about your Substack is it's very balanced, right? Because you've consider, like, if there's a threat coming from the left on religious liberty, right, and free exercise and these things, you have reports on those, and you also hold the religious right and stuff to account. And I think you do it in a very even-keeled way. Whereas there have been some publications where sometimes they can get lopsided, right? And I guess it can go either way, right? If it's a more conservative publication, right, well, all you're going to see is the left is attacking religious liberty, but and sometimes Adventist publications have tended the other way, where it's more of a left-wing bias, and so they're sometimes blind to some threats that come from the left. But just prophetically, right, I think it's really important that we understand that there's in the end times, there's and just going Daniel 11, right? There's a religious persecuting power, and we know that in the final crisis that'll be the more dangerous one. But there's also a more secular persecuting power, and so I've just appreciated that balance. But how do I guess so? For a question, is like could you expound a little bit on how you keep that balanced outlook and how you would encourage people to think about religious liberty that way?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, professionally, I do employment defense. So I represent defendants who are being sued by people who claim different things. And so we really, I try to be balanced because I know that there's another side to the story. And I want people to be able to look at something and say, hey, I understand this. This gave me more of an understanding of the issue. It didn't convince me of anything necessarily, but it kind of gave me a deeper understanding so that I can go out and make a decision on it. Like there was a story, I put out the one about the company that apparently had worked with China in the background or was allegedly. Did I just lock up there?
No.
Uh-oh.
We can hear you. Did you?
Are you there?
That? Yeah, we're here. Joey, can you hear him?
Is that my end?
Whose end is it? Uh-oh. Frozen chosen here. Some technical difficulties here. We'll try to get them fixed. We have some technical difficulties here. Yeah, I don't know what's happening. We're trying to get our guests back in. Here's Joey and Michael coming back in.
Are you there?
There we go. Technology never works so
Yeah,
well.
kick me out.
All right, go ahead,
That was
Joey.
Joey's fault. That was. Anyway,
Well, you were
we
talking
catch
about the
again?
case that you wrote about today.
On the case, what I did was I had the Ninth Circuit's opinion on the decision. I also had the person who was appealing the decision, and I had the response. And I actually used all three of those documents in order to analyze the case and put out what the arguments were and what the merits and demerits of each side were. And the main thing is to increase the value of information for people. They can understand how to read through these things for themselves and see what the different sides of the case are. A lot of religious liberty websites and blogs and things will actually, they'll be very alarmist. They'll be like, this is the end of the world. This is happening. or religious liberty is under attack, and they'll make some position out. They'll put a position out there, and it'll be either completely wrong, or it will be overly sensationalized, or it'll be about something that happened a couple of years ago. They're just trying to raise funds, and we really don't operate on a shoestring. It doesn't really cost much to do it. What I'm doing on Substack. And so the main thing is, let's put some good information out there and actually be something useful for people to look at.
Go ahead, Joey.
Yeah. One of the articles that stuck out to me recently was your one that you kind of went through the history of religious liberty, right? Because as one of my professors said when we were talking about religious liberty, America was kind of the first nation, right, that found it on the idea that religious liberty was a fundamental principle, right, rather than, various. It was generally seen in Christendom more by some sects than others that some form of religious toleration was in order, but it was very much seen as toleration. So could you kind of give kind of a brief history, like you went through of religious liberty and how it came to be something that we value in America and Western societies?
Well, that's a really short question. I mean, I can answer that in 30 seconds. Why don't we just, the history of the world as we know it, Well, the thing about religious liberty is the idea that you can believe something different from somebody else and not feel the need to kill that person. I mean, that's kind of it, because back in, all the way through history, if you didn't agree with somebody on religion, it was such a fundamental disagreement that you couldn't coexist with that person. There was no way that you could have somebody living next door to you who didn't have the same idea about God that you did. And religious freedom actually started out when you had countries that would conquer other countries. Like you had the Roman Empire, would go in and conquer different lands. And their leaders really didn't care much about what the religion was of the people there. They just wanted them to get along and not undermine their work. Even, when you go as far back as not Nebuchadnezzar, but the Cyrus who sent, was it Cyrus who helped the Jews rebuild Jerusalem?
Well, Artaxerxes was, all of them, yeah.
Cyrus, gave the decree.
Yeah, he gave the decree, right? And he says, go build your thing. It wasn't that Cyrus became Jewish then, but he said, look, if that will make the people happy and get them off my back so that I won't have to deal with a revolt, I'll give them the temple they want, and they can go there and worship however they want, and they'll be at peace with me. I won't have to worry about managing their country. In fact, they'll owe me because I built them this. I mean, you also have Herod's temple, another example of people who weren't really religious getting involved in religious things just in order to have some kind of civic peace. So you get up to the Roman ages, and you have, the Roman Empire. They were taking over in Judah as well, Jerusalem, and they let them have their own religious leaders in place. Except they said the only thing you can't do is try to undermine the authority of Caesar, because you can do whatever you want religiously, just don't get in the way of that. So when Jesus was accused of going against the government, they accused him of going against Caesar, which was saying, "Oh, he's a king over here. He's going to take over the Roman government." That's what they didn't want. So throughout history, you've had that kind of attention. Then you come to the Holy Roman Empire. You have eventually everything is like, well, if you want to have a pure society, you have to follow what we want to do. And they would persecute people who didn't agree with their religious beliefs because it was a threat to undermine their not only religious authority, but also their political authority. So I don't know how far you want me to get into this, but we're back at about the age, the year 400, 300, 400. Got another 1,700 years to go.
Let's talk about some more modern examples. Go ahead, Joey.
Well, and yeah, I was going to say, and one of the things that was jumping out at me, and I think this is correct, is for most of those people, right? Whether it be, obviously, I believe God used Cyrus, but for these people, it wasn't like, oh, I fundamentally care about the rights of these people, but it's I can appease them by, in the case of Herod, maybe building up their temple, or Cyrus, I can appease them by allowing them to do this, or like these rulers. But I guess as we were going through the history, where would you say is the point where it really started to be about this is right for people to be free to, you know, have freedom of conscience, freedom of worship, right? These things. Where did that shift come?
You're sort of talking about the difference between religious tolerance and sort of embracing of religious diversity. Would that sort of be the spot?
Yeah, or
Um,
like, yeah, as a fundamental value. Yeah.
yeah. Well, that's actually a very recent development in history. I mean, I'm talking the last 60, 70 years. There's people look at the founding of the United States and they say, well, and there was some of that there. There was definitely there was some discussion of different religious groups who were present when the Constitution was written, and there's references to that in Thomas Jefferson's writings. But the idea of embracing that kind of diversity took a while to form. You have to remember the United States has, well, let me put it this way. You have to, if you go back in history, I used to wonder this question, and I had to figure it out. I'm curious. That's why I do what I do. I wanted to know why it was that after the Declaration of Independence and the formation of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, slavery was still legal in the United States. How did that go on for nearly another 80 years, or 7 years? You can do the math on that. 87 years, I guess. But how did that continue on under those circumstances? Why was there slavery? And the reality was that there was a split between the federal government and the state governments. Federal government said, we're not going to be involved in what happens at the state level, but under federal law, you have these freedoms. You have the freedom to speak. You have the right to free exercise of religion. The government's not going to establish a religion. But that does not apply to the states. Okay? And so you ended up with places where you had states before the Civil War that had state churches and that had some kinds of religious persecution. You had people being thrown in jail for Sunday law violations, even after the Constitution was written under state law. Okay. Then the Civil War happens. And in order to be able to give the slaves freedom, and make sure it didn't come up again, and that there were human rights and voting rights and different things, Congress passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which were the Reconstruction Amendments to the Constitution. What happened at that period was the Constitution was incorporated to the states. It's called the incorporation movement. Okay? And if you look at history in the South and different places, there was more freedom. There were African American people who were running for Congress and doing stuff immediately after the Civil War, until Jim Crow law started to come back in again and try to find ways to restrict that. So that issue continued on, and there's a tension between the state and the federal government from the 1860s onward for another 100 years. It's around the end of that 100 years where you start seeing the school prayer cases going up and the Bible reading in school cases going up. And you start seeing them saying, look, these rights are incorporated in the states. You can't tell people they can't vote because of the color of their skin. You can't prevent them from entering polling places. You can't try to find different ways to block them. These are fundamental human rights that apply to all human beings. And I'm talking the 1950s, 1960s here. Okay? So it wasn't until then that the idea of religious diversity was really understood in the law, where the idea that the government really wasn't going to get involved in worship came out. So now we're, like 50, 60 years after that. And we're starting to see movements again that are attacking the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is has a due process clause in it that says states can't take away your due process rights. And every so often you hear people say, well, the original Bill of Rights said that Congress shouldn't make a law establishing religion. It doesn't say anything about the states. And the 14th Amendment that says that the states have to also follow that rule was passed at gunpoint after the Civil War, and therefore that should be done away with. That's called the de-incorporation movement to separate state rights, state laws from the federal rights. Now, a few years ago, I went to Montgomery, Alabama. Have you ever been there?
I have not.
But definitely worth visiting, because you'll remember the Montgomery bus boycott happened there. Okay, and there's a street there that leads up to the state capitol building in Montgomery. And if you go up that street, it's a street that the Civil War soldiers went up and planted the Union flag on top of the Capitol of the Confederacy. That building is still there, where Jefferson Davis was sworn in as governor. And there's a star there that overlooks the street. Dexter Avenue is the name of the street that goes to the Capitol building. You probably heard of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King gave his speeches and where he was a pastor and organized the Montgomery bus boycott. But at the end of the Dexter Avenue is the Capitol building, and there is a star in metal that is on the ground where Jefferson Davis was sworn in as the president of the Confederacy. Okay, and then the whole point of the Confederacy was to say federal law does not apply to the states. You can't tell us what we're going to do with the people who live here. We have independent rights. We are United States. We're each individual states. Okay. Then you have the 100 years later, you have the civil rights movement taking place. George Wallace is sworn in as the governor of Alabama. He stands on the same star and says, segregation now, segregation forever. You may have heard that speech before or heard about it. Okay. Yep. Looking down Dexter Avenue, immediately to the left is the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. Right? Just, few, maybe 100 feet from there. And that is where they were organizing the Montgomery boycott, the bus boycott. Okay? So the geography of this area is incredible because you have that juxtaposition where the federal and state governments are opposed to each other, and the state is saying, we're going to do whatever we want. The federal government has no say in what we're going to do here. Now, just 2 doors down beyond the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church is the Alabama State Judiciary building. In the Alabama State Judiciary building is where they have their Supreme Court, and Roy Moore was one of the justices on the Supreme Court who put up a monument of the 10 Commandments in that building. You may have heard about that story. It happened about 20 years ago. He put up a stone monument of the 10 Commandments in the Alabama State Judiciary, and he said, guess what he said? He said, this is a state right to have this here. It's not a federal right. Federal government can't tell me what to do. He got sued in federal court. He was asked to remove it by the federal government, and that became another tension point. So you can see over this time that there's been a lot of tension between the federal and the state governments concerning the 14th Amendment, which has incorporated the Bill of Rights in the states, saying that states have to follow the Bill of Rights. And I was just hearing the other day, there's been a movement to try to get rid of the 14th Amendment again. And you'll see that every time somebody says, well, free exercise doesn't apply to states, or the Establishment Clause doesn't apply to the states, it only applies to the federal government. It's an attempt to roll back that crucial piece of history, and ultimately it strips away the Bill of Rights from applying by state government actions. So the idea of diversity of religious freedom is new. It's within many of our lifetimes, and it is under significant pressure even now. There's, I can go on some more about this, but there was a bill, and I wrote about this for Liberty some years back, about 10 years ago, actually about 15 years ago, and it's coming up every so often, it comes up again, called the Constitution Restoration Act, which was going to essentially say that states could do what they want when it comes to how they treat religion within their borders. And that was sponsored by Roy Moore's attorney. So it's a live struggle. That's really where the battle of religious liberty is taking place in terms of whether or not you have freedom of religion or the government will establish religion.
Where do you think?
Well,
Go ahead, Joe.
Oh, well, yeah, I was just going to say, so first of all, that's really interesting history. And I think it's one of those things that there has always been this tension, right, between federal power, state power. And through different periods of history, there have been, right, so for instance, I think the 13, 14, 15 amendments were crucial, right? And I think it was really important to understand what Lincoln was doing, right? Because a lot of people, obviously the Civil War was over slavery, but it was over slavery in a specific way, right? As I know Harry Jaffa has talked about this and stuff, but it was over slavery in the fact of Lincoln was saying, because, well, some of the detractors who want to paint him as a racist will say, they'll point to his comments where he said, if I could preserve the Union without freeing a single slave, I'd do it. He did say that, but what they don't understand is what Lincoln was actually saying is, I want to preserve the Union as the founding principle. In other words, I want to preserve a particular kind of union, and he saw it as the union of the founders. And so he didn't see, some people have said, well, it's a dichotomy, really. It was two different nations, but it was really just the principles of the founding, the Declaration, right? Religious liberty, these things. I mean, no one was more explicit about how men should be free in matters of religion than Thomas Jefferson. I mean, the Virginia, I always forget what it's called, the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, right? I mean,
Yeah.
read that, it's very clear. If someone has a different religion than me, and it's the famous line is like, it doesn't break my leg nor pick my pocket, right? And so, it's like they should be matter free. And James Madison similarly. But yet, the major compromise, as you pointed to, was slavery. But in a way, I think the other compromise was that some of the states were going to have different views on some of these things. And I think the founders kind of, at least this is my perspective from their readings and stuff, is they believed that these ideas had a certain trajectory, right? Like, for instance, slavery, they believed that, they put certain clauses, like they intended that the slave trade was going to be ended in 20 years, like as far as importing new slaves. And they kind of just saw that if the Declaration and Constitution remain intact, then this is going to die out on its own accord. That's what Lincoln believed as well, until, the Southerners forced the issue and, they fired first, but he was willing to go to war for that. And I think it's important because the reason why I think that dichotomy is important is because one thing that I've often heard some people in our denomination who I think may be well-meaning, but they'll point to, the issues that America had, and they'll say, well, America was really, the beast from the beginning, right? And it had, religious persecution of the states. But the way, at least how I see it is, those things, right, whether it be slavery, which was gravely evil, or religious persecution at the state level, that was this new country, right, doing what everybody had been doing before. That was doing what Europe. But what they did in the Constitution and the Declaration was them trying out a new thing. And that new thing, as you pointed out, it took some growing pains. But insofar as the nation, again, was the nation of the founders, was the nation Lincoln fought to preserve, it generally made strides in the right direction. Obviously, we know at some point, right, it's going to make strides in the opposite direction. And I think, at least in my personal opinion, that's when I would start saying that America is beginning to speak like a beast when it goes in the opposite. And we can argue as to what
But you have to
degree.
remember, though, half the country was against slavery.
Yeah.
You had it was split down the middle. There was a Missouri Compromise. There's some really bad stuff that happened, but it was a very divisive issue at that time. And the reality is, I mean, I talk about how the religion wasn't, there wasn't a lot of diversity of religion, or there was not a lot of appreciation for that. That's really not the way it developed, because the practical thing was people wanted to live at peace with their neighbors. And there was not like a religious compulsion at that time after the founding to be of certain religious belief. There were a lot of different religious groups in the United States at the time. I think there's some persecution between different groups, but it wasn't a lot of it compared with what you saw in, if you compare the United States with, France during the French Revolution at the same period in time, it's a totally different ballgame. So, and I think, by and large, the United States has been probably the greatest promoter of religious freedom around the world. And it's been the greatest place for religious freedom. And that stands up against secular states and hyper-religious states and hyper-religious government. I mean, state by, nations of the world. And so there are a lot of times people will be like, well, it's got its problems, therefore it's the worst country in the world. I don't buy that at all. I mean, very fortunate to have grown up and lived in the United States, and very proud of the country for what it's done and what it's been through. Certainly not perfect, as you know, but we've, it's been a struggle. But the reality is that the ability to have conversations like this, be able to talk openly and honestly about the government, is another luxury that many people in the world just don't have. So we're very fortunate.
Amen. Did you have a question, Gio?
No, yeah, I wanted to talk about Venezuela, his views on that,
Mm.
and what Trump did, and what's going on with Greenland. There's a lot of huffing and puffing, but what do you think, or how do you think it ends there in Greenland?
Greenland, or I'll start with Venezuela. It's there's I put something out about this last week. There is a process for doing stuff that the U.S. government, presidents have to do in order to go into another country, and sometimes you can have the right result, but the method is wrong. And I'm not sure, and I'm not an expert in international affairs or anything, but I think going to Congress and getting some kind of consensus before raiding another country and taking their president captive is probably a good idea. But then on the other hand, if he telegraphed everything he's going to do, we probably would have ended up in a war there if they really pushed it. So it's that issue of Venezuela is still up in the air for me. I know a lot of Venezuelan people are extremely happy to see the changes in the government, moving away from communism toward hopefully more of a democracy.
What about the notion that they didn't view him as the legitimate leader, therefore it's almost like rescuing somebody from hostage situation?
Well, politically, I don't want to get into that. But there have been presidents of the United States who people are like, that person's not the legitimate president of the United States, therefore they're not my president. And, you might come to the place where you could split a country in half over that issue. We went through January 6th and the whole thing that happened then because some people didn't believe it was a legitimate president. So, that issue is still up in the air as they're researching it, figuring out exactly what happened in those elections. But, and there's a lot of countries in the world that didn't recognize the president of Venezuela, but I don't know. I'd have to.
One thing that I would say, I think it's important to keep an eye on this because but at least I was doing some research for an article I was writing, and now I'm going to forget the WPR, right? The War Power, is it War Powers? Is it WPA or WPA? Well, it's either War Powers Resolution or Act, one or the other. But
Uh-huh.
basically, it gives the president, so after taking military action, he has 48 hours to inform Congress. And
Mhm.
then Congress can decide, and we're seeing senators and Congress people now talking about that. And they can then decide, okay, is the president going to be allowed further action in this country or whatever? And if he were to violate, well, I think he has 60 days if they, whatever, to, you know, to do whatever, to wrap up whatever this incursion is. Um, and that, but that's pending that Congress continues to allow him the authority. But at least from what I understand of the WPR, it gives him pretty broad authority to over the military. He just has 48 hours after initiating action. Um, Obviously, there's been questions I know about, and I think this will kind of go into the question I kind of had for you. But obviously, I think what senators like Rand Paul and people are arguing is that even some of the provisions and that are often unenforced of the WPA give the president, the executive, and this is prior to Trump too, a lot of power in terms of foreign policy,
Mhm.
where people like Rand Paul would argue that was supposed to be Congress, and it's kind of been a workaround from Congress. And I guess for my question, it would be with Trump now saying in an interview that the only thing that limits what he'll do on the foreign policy is is his own personal morality. I guess how could you see? I guess I'm trying to say exactly how I think this, but how could you see that maybe impacting whether it's religious liberty somehow or kind of the process that protects our civil liberties?
Fair. That kind of bugged me a lot because, well, the reality is, yeah, the president has a lot of powers. And that's been established since the Bush administration when John Yoo put out a document put out a memo about the unitary executive saying that when the country is at war, the president is at the zenith of his powers. And ever since that point, the United States has really deferred to the president on their actions when it comes to these kind of things. The problem is that the entire way the United States government is set to work is supposed to be really slow and bogged down. You're supposed to go through all these layers of authority in order to get anything done. And that way it preserves, checks and balances and all that stuff. And when you have a president who's like, well, I can do whatever I want. I mean, most of the time presidents don't talk about the extent of their power. You don't have people going up and, running for president and just saying, I can do this and I can do that. And, forget you, I'm going to do whatever I want. That's kind of a difference that we've got right now. That kind of bothers me because I think whenever you have that kind of power, you'll notice that kind of executive power is mostly outward facing to other countries. It's not like what the president can do within the United States, except now we're seeing that happen as well. And sometimes you may like what happens, and sometimes you may not like what happens. But the idea that you have a president exercising that kind of authority should be troubling, just because you don't know what the extent of that authority is going to be, what the extent of his morality is, and he's not going to be president forever. There's going to be somebody else after him, and what are they going to do with that same power when they get it? Power. Once the presidency accumulates power, the government accumulates power. It doesn't go back. So I see a lot of people are like, well, I love Trump, and if you don't like what he did in Venezuela, or you question what he did in, or whatever, if you don't like it, then you're not a patriotic American. And I'm like, well, you got to think here. We have 3 years left of the Trump presidency. Then you're going to have, if history serves correct, there's a 50% chance that there's going to be a Democrat in office in 4 years who's going to be taking over this entire thing and have no constraint whatsoever on their power, because he's kind of like stretched it out, made it, gotten a huge amount of power that he can move within. And that scares me, because I mean, you look at what happened during COVID, you look at, different presidency, different political people in authority, what happened, and it can be unlimited. There can be a lot of stuff that goes on. And so I would hope that the courts, and I would hope that the Congress and everybody sees that there's a limit to this kind of authority. If not for this presidency, then for the future. If they, if they like they say he's our guy, we like everything he does. I hope they will actually look at it and say, hey, there's going to be somebody else with this power later on. And we are creating a monster that's going to come up in the next 15, 20 years.
It seems like both parties are blind to that, right? Because the more they consolidate power, the more it's gonna have these pendulum swings of things half the country likes and then things half the country doesn't like, and back and forth depending on the party. But how would you balance that? I mean, Congress seems to do nothing on both sides, really, and so it is seems to be consolidating the power in the executive branch. At this point, how do we correct that?
What do you do about it? That's a good question. I mean, we're individual human beings. There's not a lot of political power. I think one of the things is educating people about how the Constitution should work is one of the ways to do it. And sort of build a fundamental understanding of where we're at. Not where we should be, but where we're at. And say, look, here's it's like, I always talk to people and then they go off on some ideological angle where, well, it should be such and such a way. It should be like this. Well, it's not that way. It's going to be, you got to play the ball where it is. You can't, just put it on the green and chip it in or whatever. That's the wrong word. But
golf, that analogy will work. What about Greenland in the few minutes we have remaining? What personally, knowing Trump and how he likes to be bombastic, I don't think he would attack Greenland militarily, but he puts it out there because he wants people to know that everything is possibly on the table. But what do you see happening there? And is his concern legitimate?
Well, I think stuff, I always look to geography. In fact, today I was thinking about Greenland, and they have these websites where you can put up a state and see how big it is next to another one. And Greenland looked to be roughly the size of Alaska, except Greenland has just a few people, 55,000 people who live on the coast, and the rest of Greenland is a massive ice sheet. They have no idea what Greenland looks like underneath the ice. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but there's this massive sheet of glacial ice up there. Okay, so it's not it's a very strong strategic place. They could have people, there are a lot of places, move from militaries to move if they want to go way up in the Arctic Circle and do stuff. I don't know if that's what Russia wants to do or China wants to do. But, the way the world is shaped, round, like my bald head, they can all kind of meet up at the top. And so I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I think Denmark is, they like to have Greenland, but Denmark sold us the U.S. Virgin Islands for $20 million in gold in 1917, I think it was. I don't have to look at. So it's not unheard of that they may actually decide to, hey, let's let it go. Not as a matter of, it could just, they might let it go. I don't know. I don't think the U.S. really has a strong interest in going to war over it. I think it would be the stupidest war in history. And I also think it'd be, really bad on the world stage. But I think the U.S. may put an offer out there for $500 billion or something and say, look, we'll give you the money. We'll we'll give $5 billion to the 55,000 people in Greenland, make them the richest people in the world, and just buy it. I don't know.
Yeah, one thing about that is when Trump. So first of all, the thing that I find odd is Trump didn't run on Greenland, right? Trump didn't run on promises, and after being elected, he starts saying. I mean, he had said some things in the first administration, but the election in 2024 was not about that. That nobody ran on. He ran on, no new wars, all these things. Um, but when he first floated it, my opinion was basically, sure, if Congress comes up with some kind of package to try to entice the Greenlanders and the Danes, I don't have an issue with that. And there is rare earth minerals. That's true. It is, the Arctic Circle is important. Um, and yeah, like, okay, fine. If you would offer citizenship or path to citizenship to the 55,000 Greenlanders, that could make it really enticing, right? Because then, they'd be American, whatever. Like, there's ways that this could be mutually. I guess where I became anti the thing is as it escalates the threats, and then I kind of think of things through the lens of prophecy. Again, I'm not saying this is anything, to your point before, we should be cautious and we should watch for signs, but we shouldn't claim more, get over our skis and making claims. But yeah, I think when you have the president of the United States and then the vice president threatening a friend, which is what Denmark is, right? The Danes lost more of their own people than any other nation besides us in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Against what has been said by the administration about, well, we don't know if NATO would come to our security if we needed it. We do know they did after 9/11, right? They came, and whether it was Ukrainians who aren't even in NATO or the actual members of the NATO alliance, they did come to our aid. They did fight beside us. And so, yeah, I mean, I can see elements of beastly speak when you're trying to bully a smaller nation that poses no risk to you, a nation that both Denmark and Greenland would be perfectly happy if the US were to say tomorrow, hey, I'd like three more bases in Greenland and I'd like, several thousand troops. They'd be like, okay, yeah, have them come as part of the alliance. That's fine. We don't care about American presence here. So in other words, when it said it's national security concerns, it's like, I don't see any potential national security concern that couldn't be addressed by calling up our friends in Greenland and Denmark. And I don't see anything why we would go about this in any way other than if we're going to make an offer, we're going to make an offer. So I guess I do see an element of kind of beastly speak there. But then I also see an element of just Trump kind of being the big mouth that he's been since the days of The Apprentice. So is it like a 5 alarm fire? Probably not. I don't think the Senate is. I mean, I know the Senate is not up for this. So I think it's something to keep an eye on. And always, we look at things through the lens of Bible prophecy. But I loved how you put it. Is like, don't be an alarmist, because then if you make too many predictions and say, well, this is the end of the world, well, then it's the boy who cried wolf, and souls might be lost because we did that. So I think it's important to
Lose credibility if you cry wolf.
Yeah. I used to think of it like we're down the freeway and somebody's driving along with their blinker on for 5 miles. First you come up behind them and you're like, well, they're probably going to move it, and I should just wait a minute, right? And then it keeps blinking, and then you eventually go past them and you look over them and you think, oh, that person's a nut. Their blinker's been on for half an hour and they're not going anywhere. Don't drive around with your blinker on.
The eventual right turn when the blinker is perpetual. And once again, let people know where they can find your Substack and how they can.
Yeah, go to religiouslibertytv.substack.com. religiouslibertytv.substack.com.
Okay, cool. Give us some party wisdom as we see things like the Heritage Foundation, the thing in Venezuela, Greenland issues, and stuff happening in Minnesota and locally. what would you tell the audience is the main thing we should keep an eye on as we try to navigate all these news bombarding us from left and right?
So pay attention to what's going on. Look at both sides of every issue, but be sure to, um, you can't go wrong when you're in favor of people and you're caring about people and you love people and you want to take care of people. Um, there's there's so much stuff that's always going to be happening. I pay attention to it because I'm a kind of a nerd.
Mm-hmm.
I like law and I like religious liberty and stuff. But the reality is, religious liberty is a supporting ministry. It's a fire extinguisher behind a glass that you need to break open and make sure it's charged up, but you pull out when you need it. The real work is happening when people are reaching people for Christ and doing things to further the kingdom of God and in their own lives. And religious liberty will help with that, but it's not the entree.
Yep.
Mm.
Joey, closing thoughts as we wrap up?
I think that was excellent, right? We have to use our religious liberty, right? America, I think, is the greatest nation that ever existed because it brought these principles into the world, right? And as you pointed out earlier, it has done more than any other nation to spread those principles and been responsible for them being emulated. So I think, it's great. But at the same time, the church in America, the free church, now it's done a lot of good and it still does a lot of good, right? Christians in America are some of the most generous people in terms of adoption and these things. So I'm not one of those people who's like, oh, the church is terrible. No, the church does good things. But we know in the Bible that the church at the end, right? Obviously, I believe this is the Adventist church, but it could be said it's just about people who love Jesus, but they tend to in the end, right, they're in a condition where they're a little lukewarm, right? And I think that describes the American church, right? Like, especially of the last, decades, right? Where we've never been more free. I mean, this is a point David French makes on advisory opinions. Because of various court opinions and whatnot, the state of legal religious liberty has never been better. Now, I would say, to people like Jack Phillips and whatnot that yes, the Supreme Court came out in favor of them. That was still a decade of their life, in court. But at the end of the day, and this was David's point, at the end of the day, we have a court that has come down almost every time in favor of religious exercise and religious freedom. And so we've never had more freedom. And yet, right, we feel like, the church is, we're losing our young people, right? Our churches are shrinking, our schools are shrinking. And so I would just say, and it kind of brings to mind a quote from Ellen White, where she says that the work that we should have done or that we could have done in times of peace and safety, we will have to do under the most stupendous crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I would just say to people is, we do still have a lot of freedom in America. America is still the greatest nation in the world, but we know at some point we're going to lose that freedom. So let's get down to work, like you were saying, Michael, now about let's get the message of the gospel to everyone, right? Like something I've just kind of been feeling impressed about. So I've started carrying tracts in my Carhartt when I go places, is because I just had this impression when I see, I go get gas and there's the teller. What if no one ever tells that guy that Jesus loves him and urges him to make a decision, or the teller at a grocery store? And I feel like we need to recognize that the freedom that you outline threats to it, right? The freedom that our Constitution urges us, it's there for a reason, and that's for religious people to actually exercise their faith. So
Mm-hmm.
I just think that was a great reminder.
Yeah. Well, religious liberty is a little doorstop, holding the door open to do that. You don't pay attention. We're there. We're glad to be there, but that's not the main work. You got to be using the door.
Yeah, and it's the same thing with the right arm or the gospel, right? The health message. It's not the main thing, but it's definitely an avenue that can help lead people Michael, I want to thank you once again. And once again, that Substack is Religious Liberty TV/Substack. Michael Peabody's his name. He writes often. As Joey stated, he's very balanced. So until next time on the Gio and Joey Show, be blessed.